I slept with my boss because he felt superior to my husband. His revenge still haunts me. It all started on an ordinary night, one of those long evenings before a company event. I worked in public relations for a management company, which meant I was constantly on my feet organizing and networking. Aside from your actual work, another way to make an impression was to show up for the many events that the company always threw. So at that time, I was attending them more than usual because I was trying to get my boss to notice me. I wanted to prove that I was competent, a team player, and the best person for this promotion I'd been eyeing. Javier, my boss, was the kind of man people naturally gravitated toward. He just kind of had this presence about him, like he commanded every room he stepped into. And I wanted to be seen by him because that meant a better position for me. That night, I was anxious. I knew that the party would be an important opportunity for me to make my mark in his mind and get him to stop seeing me as just another face in the department. My husband, Eddie, was supportive in many other ways, but he never came with me to these things. Not like he didn't want to go, it just wasn't something either of us had ever brought up. But that night was different, though, because he came up to me while I was getting ready, made a comment about how I'd been attending so many of the company events recently, and then asked if he could tag along for the first time. I said sure. I really didn't think anything of it at the time. In fact, I even thought it would be good for Javier and the rest of the higher-ups to see how stable and balanced my life was. I thought it would make me seem like someone who had her life together, an obvious choice for more responsibility and pay. But instead, it was one of the worst mistakes I've ever made. When we arrived, the venue was already packed and everyone seemed to be having a good time. I spent most of the night greeting people, making small talk, and introducing Eddie. He shook hands, smiled politely, and made conversation when necessary. He looked slightly out of place in his simple button-down shirt among all the tailored suits, but he didn't seem to mind. I was honestly impressed considering how introverted he was most of the time. Everything was going great. That was until it was time to introduce Eddie to Javier. I spotted him across the room before we reached him, and even from a distance, Javier commanded attention. He was speaking to a group of board members, and I couldn't hear a word that he was saying, but I knew he was the one commanding the conversation. Seeing him made my pulse jump in a way I couldn't have explained at the time, but I ignored it. By the time we reached him, I was practically performing. It wasn't intentional at first. I just slipped into the version of myself I always became around Javier. I was smiling at him, wider than I had smiled at anyone else that night, and I laughed at one of the jokes he told the members of the board, even though I wasn't a part of the conversation. It's honestly humiliating to think about now. It was after my laugh that he finally glanced at me and he smiled. He excused himself from the people he was talking to and turned to face us. So I greeted him, and because I wasn't sure if he knew who I was, I instantly started bringing up the project that I had sent in a few days before and how he had praised it. He cut me off halfway, though, and told me that he remembered. The compliment made my face warm, and I had to look down to hide my blush. It was only when Eddie cleared his throat that I remembered he was beside me, and I quickly introduced him to Javier. They shook hands and made small talk, but neither of them smiled. It wasn't open hostility or anything, just this weird energy. I forced a smile and pretended not to notice the subtle power dynamic that had shifted the air around us. He insisted on coming tonight, I said to Javier, even though he hadn't even asked. Javier nodded. He was polite, but ultimately disinterested in knowing more about Eddie, which should have upset me, but honestly, in that moment, all I could focus on was him. Eddie was pushed to the back of my mind in Javier's presence. He turned to me and asked a few things about work, and then Eddie was truly pushed out of the conversation. It was the most attention Javier had paid me in weeks, and I couldn't pass up the chance for Eddie's feelings. I was nodding along to everything he was saying, completely forgetting that Eddie was hanging around by my side and waiting for me. Eventually, Eddie cut into the conversation and added a few points. It wasn't anything serious. It was what any partner would do in that situation. The problem was that it didn't have the desired effect. My attention was focused on Eddie again like he wanted, but it was for all the wrong reasons. Because in that moment, the contrast between them hit me hard. And I couldn't help but notice how Javier was everything Eddie wasn't. He was wealthy and confident, effortlessly sure of himself, and very magnetic. Even his suit looked like it belonged on the cover of some men's magazine, while Eddie's looked a little ill-fitted and slightly too big for him. Next to him, Eddie seemed smaller somehow, and a lot more ordinary. I hated myself for thinking that, but the thought stayed. Once it was in my mind, I couldn't get it out. It was all I could see. As the evening went on, I couldn't stop noticing the differences and how much of a better man Javier seemed in comparison to Eddie. And Eddie tried to hold his own and remain gracious in the way that he spoke to my coworkers and everything, but there was just no competition. When he spoke, I could tell that he was nervous and desperate to make a good impression. But when Javier spoke, it was in this self-assured, easy way that always got people to listen. I spent the entire night thinking about how different they were and how Javier was my husband's superior in every way. I had never thought about it before because up until that night, they had never been in the same room together, and it didn't help that I kept catching Javier's eye from across the room. There was just this way that he looked at me. It was difficult to ignore, and it made me feel a lot of things that I definitely shouldn't have been feeling about my boss. When it was time to leave, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me. Eddie drove while I stared out the window, replaying the night in my head. I wasn't sure what I felt. It was this strange mixture of guilt, confusion, and curiosity. I realized on the drive home that I was attracted to my boss, and what was even worse was that it had taken me noticing all the ways my husband was less than for me to realize that. It all made me feel sick with guilt, and I stayed quiet the entire ride home. I was so caught up in my own head that I didn't even notice that Eddie was quiet as well, and that I wasn't the only one who had noticed something strange between me and Javier. The house felt unusually quiet when we got back and made our way upstairs. Both stayed quiet as we undressed. I was being quiet because of all that was going on in my head, and I thought Eddie was quiet because he was tired, but I was wrong. I didn't, it thought, until he spoke up. What was that? The words stopped me in my tracks, and I paused, taking off one of my shoes. His voice wasn't angry yet, but it wasn't casual either. There was a sharp edge to it. I took off my shoe and turned to him slowly. What was what? He ran a hand over his jaw and responded, You know what I'm talking about, tonight, with your boss. I frowned and pretended not to understand. I told him that I was just talking to Javier like I always do, and there was nothing special that happened. Eddie let out this short, humorless laugh. Talking to him, that's what you call that? Then he shook his head and took a few steps closer to me. You were acting like a completely different person. I've never seen you like that, not with anyone. My stomach was all tight, but I tried to sound calm when I told him it had just been me trying to network and get in his good graces. But of course he didn't believe me. He said I'd been practically glued to Javier all night, that I was laughing too hard and flattering him, and that I barely even looking in his direction. It hurt hearing that, mostly because there was some truth to it, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing that it stung, so I brushed him off and said he was overreacting. I explained to him that I'd been trying to get noticed for months, and if that meant turning on the charm a little, then what was the harm in it? But he just wouldn't drop it. He said it wasn't charm and that I was full on fawning over Javier. He demanded that I tell him what was going on. Something in me snapped at that. I got angry and I lashed out. I told him he was unbelievable and that he was the one who insisted on coming when I'd been fine going alone. I argued that I was just being polite to Javier, but Eddie didn't see it that way. He said that I looked at him like he hung the damn moon, and it wasn't just polite. By then, my anger had tangled with my guilt so badly I couldn't tell which was which. All I could do was get defensive. I told him he was twisting everything and I was just doing my job. And after that, he stayed quiet for a bit, so much so that I started to get scared. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and sad. He asked if he should be worried, and for a moment I couldn't speak, because I didn't know the answer either. Worried about what? I asked, even though I already knew what he meant. About him, Eddie responded, and about you, about whatever that was tonight. The question hit me like a slap. I felt my face heat up from anger, humiliation, guilt, and just about everything else. I asked if he really thought so little of me, and he shrugged and said that he knew what he saw. And that was the final crack in my patience. Everything I'd been holding spilled over all at once. I told him that he needed to stop acting like my ambition and me getting ahead was some slight against him. I told him he was immature, insecure, and couldn't see the bigger picture. I said he was making it about himself when it had always been about my work. that he was twisting everything because, for once, he hadn't been the center of attention. It was after I'd said all that he finally ripped the Band-Aid off and asked what I knew he'd been wanting to since the moment we got back home. He looked me in the eyes, glared me honestly, and asked me if I was all over Javier because I was trying to sleep with him. He asked if that was my own method of getting ahead and seeing the bigger picture. Him throwing my words back at me hurt, and what hurt even more were his accusations. The way I had acted with Javier wasn't great, I knew that. But to accuse me of shit like that when that was the first time he'd ever even seen Javier and I interact was crazy. So I said, "You know what? You can take your insecurity and your cheap accusations and deal with them on your own. I'm not going to apologize for wanting more than the bare minimum." Bare minimum? His voice cracked when he said it, but I was past the point of caring then. I've done everything I can for us. For you. I shook my head and said, "You've done everything you can to keep things exactly the same. Now you're acting like a self-conscious man-child because I want something different for us." That really struck a nerve with him because he looked furious. It was like his eyes darkened when he said, "And you're acting like a woman who's ready to trade her vows for a promotion." That was about as much as I could take. I couldn't stand there trading awful words and accusations with him. His words hurt, and I knew that if I stayed in that room, we would say even worse to each other, so I shook my head and stepped away. I didn't say another word to him as I grabbed my phone and walked out of the room. I spent that night in the guest room. I remember crying a little, but mostly I remember wondering if that simple interaction with Javier had led to all the animosity between us, or if it had been buried underneath for a while, and I wondered if Eddie's accusations had some merit. Because the truth was, I had liked the way Javier looked at me. I had liked the attention and the validation, and I knew that I wanted more of it. Things between us didn't get any better in the days after the fight. There was no apology from him or me. We kind of just circled around each other and the things that we said, and we avoided each other. As much as we could anyway. The tension followed me everywhere, though. It weighed heavy on me in a way no other fight with Eddie had. It left me feeling upset and dejected most days, and eventually it started to bleed into my work. My concentration slipped, and I started to zone out during meetings. My work suffered because of how distracted I was. I tried to bury myself in work, but that didn't work. Javier noticed before anyone else did. He called me into his office one afternoon. I thought I was going to get yelled at, reprimanded for the subpar job I was doing, but all he did was ask if I was all right. That threw me off guard a bit, but I tried to play it off. I smiled and said I was fine, just a little tired, but he didn't believe me. He stared at me like he was looking through me. I knew that he knew I wasn't telling the truth, and I was scared he was going to ask more about it. But he surprised me again when he told me I really didn't seem fine and that we should get lunch. He said it would be his treat and that I looked like I could use a break. I hesitated and asked if that was even allowed. It wasn't time for my lunch break yet, so I would have been cutting out early, but he just laughed and said, "There isn't much I'm not allowed to do." It shouldn't have made me blush, but it did. The confidence and the quiet arrogance that he had should have made me roll my eyes. It probably would have on anyone else, but with him it was different. It was magnetic. We went to a small place around the corner. I ordered something I barely tasted because my nerves wouldn't settle. We made small talk at first. We discussed safe things like upcoming campaigns and the logistics for the next event, but somewhere between the second refill of coffee and the waiter clearing our plates, he asked again if I was okay. His voice was so soft and warm. It was like he actually cared about me and about making sure that I was fine. So in my moment of weakness, I told him that things at home weren't great. I didn't go into detail, and luckily he didn't ask. He just nodded and didn't push. Instead, he took it upon himself to distract me from how I was feeling by telling me stories about some of the more over-the-top celebrities and influencers he'd worked with over the years. By the time the dessert he ordered came, I was laughing. Like genuinely laughing. It was the first time I'd laughed in a while, and I was surprised by how much lighter it made me feel. We continued talking after that. Not about anything important, just getting to know each other, really. When we left, I realized I hadn't thought about Eddie or our fight once during that hour. After that, things shifted between us. He started greeting me differently and smiling at me more. Sometimes when he passed my desk, he'd leave me a coffee and a pastry from the cafe where we'd had lunch. It became this quiet routine that I hoped no one else would notice. I knew it wasn't appropriate. Each time I saw what he left for me, I felt happy, and then I felt guilty for getting so excited. I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. It felt good to be seen and gifted nice things. I can admit that now. A few weeks later, I stayed late to finish a campaign proposal, and I didn't realize Javier was still there until I heard his door open and shut. The next thing I knew, he was poking his head into my office and asking if I was heading out. When I said yes, he asked if he could walk me to my car. It was late, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I agreed. We rode the elevator down together, and the silence between us was oddly comfortable. When we got to my car, he didn't immediately say goodbye. Instead, he reached into his pocket and hesitated only a little before he pulled out a small velvet box. He said that he wanted to give me something away from all the prying eyes. Inside were earrings, these delicate, gold, expensive-looking earrings. For a moment, I couldn't breathe or even say anything, and I didn't need to because he kept speaking. He said he'd noticed I hadn't been wearing any lately, and that it should be a crime for someone so beautiful not to have something equally beautiful to match. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him it wasn't appropriate, that it was too much, but all I could do was stare at them, and then at him. His smile in that moment felt like everything to me, and I pictured it in my head and held the earring in my palm as I drove home. My old favorite pair had broken weeks ago. Eddie hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed that I'd stopped wearing them, or that my jewelry box sat untouched. But Javier had. That gift made it harder not to think about how Javier always seemed to notice what Eddie didn't. And I hated that I could feel the comparison forming in my chest again, just like that night at the event. But I couldn't help it. Javier was better than Eddie in every visible way, and no matter how much I loved my husband, I couldn't pretend that I didn't see it. After that night in the parking lot, things felt more intense with Javier and I. At first, I told myself it was just friendly, a boss taking care of his employee, but then the lunches became a regular thing. I knew it was wrong because we literally had to sneak around to do them. I always left first, and then he would follow after me a few minutes later to avoid suspicion. And at least, in the beginning, those moments were innocent. It was just us getting lunch at the cafe that had gradually become our spot, and talking about our days or our weekends. It wasn't romantic, not in the beginning. That was what I held on to each night I went home, and Eddie asked, as his way of reaching out, how work had gone. I would always tell him it went fine, leaning out the time I spent with Javier and feeling guilty after. Still, I rationalized it. Javier was my boss. We were allowed to have lunch. We were allowed to talk. He was just helping my career. That was what I told myself again and again. But the line between professional and personal blurred fast when began treating me differently in ways I couldn't ignore. He would give me, and only me, extensions on deadlines and approvals on my pitches came quicker. I remember there was this one afternoon during a meeting when one of the senior supervisors began critiquing a proposal I'd written. Before I could even defend it, Javier interrupted him mid-sentence and argued that my work was fine the way it was. Then he demanded that everyone move on. After that, it was hard to keep lying to myself, especially when our late nights at the office became more frequent, always under the excuse of extra work. But we both knew we weren't really staying behind for the work anymore. It was for us, for the thing between us that didn't have a name. We spent those nights just talking about anything and everything under the sun. Being with him felt easy in a way it hadn't felt with Eddie in a long time. One night, after hours of talking, he leaned back and said, "You know, your promotion is closer than you think." My head lifted immediately. Really? Thinking back now, it's almost pathetic how hopeful I sounded. He smiled. "You've been doing everything right. Just keep it up." The way he said it made my stomach flip. I wanted to believe him, and I wanted to feel like I'd finally been seen for all the hard work I'd done. But part of me knew that he wasn't just talking about my performance. After that night, though, I couldn't stop thinking about him. All my thoughts were consumed by him, and I wondered if I actually liked him or if I was just blinded by everything he represented. The power and money, things Eddie, no matter how hard he worked, could never give me. When I caught myself daydreaming about him in the middle of a meeting, I realized I was in trouble. but still, I couldn't stop. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. Then one night, after everyone else had gone home, we found ourselves hanging back again. This time, we were sitting together on the couch in his office again. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that had been building for weeks. At first, we just talked, but then things shifted when he got closer to me. He tucked my hair behind my ear and cupped my face. Then he told me that he'd always thought that I was beautiful. That alone had my breath hitch, but then he continued and said, "And capable. You deserve that promotion more than anyone else here." His words hit me like a wave. No one had said something that tender or that confident about me in a long time. Not Eddie, not anyone. Hearing validate me like that tore away the last bit of resistance I had left. And before I could stop myself, I leaned in and kissed him. It was slow at first, but then it got more intense as time went on. And eventually things got so heated that we started to reach for each other's clothes. I let everything else fade, both guilt and logic, and I had SF with him right there in his office. We crossed the line that night, one I could never go back from. When I finally got home, the reality of what I'd done still hadn't fully settled in. Not until I saw Eddie sitting in the living room. My stomach dropped. And for a second, I thought he knew. That somehow, in the span of an hour, everything had unraveled and he had found out. But when he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes. He just said, "Hey, you're back." And I forced a smile and told him it had been a long day. Seeing him made me feel awful, and I was just about to tell him that I needed to go to bed when he said that he didn't want to bother me. He just wanted to know if we were still going to dinner that Friday. For a moment, I was confused, and then it hit me. Friday was our anniversary. We'd gone to the same Italian place every year since we'd gotten married. Eddie always had to pick up extra shifts just to afford it, and I'd always teased him about it, even though I secretly loved the tradition. The realization that he was planning our anniversary dinner while I was out with another man made me feel sick. So I rushed to tell him yes and that I wouldn't miss it. He smiled at me, this big genuine smile that hurt my heart, and said he'd already made the reservations. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Javier's face, and then Eddie's right after. The guilt was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. And it was that made me realize how much I still loved my husband. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Whatever had started between Javier and me had to end. No matter how much I tried to justify it, it was wrong. And deep down, I knew it. And I couldn't keep living like that anymore. I went into work days later rehearsing how I'd end things. I thought of telling him that it was unwise to mix business with whatever it was we were doing. I didn't even have a word for it, but it needed to end before it got any worse. I knew that. The moment I stepped into his office, I felt all my resolve and my words slipping away. Javier smiled at me. He looked oddly excited in a way that made me want to smile back at him. He waved me inside and then told me to close the door. I was hesitant because we usually kept the door open when other people were around, but I closed it anyway. "I just got out of a meeting with the partners," he said, still smiling. "They've agreed to the new restructuring proposal. And guess whose name came up for potential department lead?" I stood there blankly and blinked a few times. My voice was barely audible when I asked, "Mine?" That was when he laughed and said, "Who else? You've earned it. You've been my best performer for months now. It's as good as done." For a moment, everything inside me went quiet. The guilt and the exhaustion, it all vanished. My chest felt light in a way it hadn't in months. I didn't even know what to say. All I could do was try to thank him. He said there was no need and that we had to celebrate properly. He said we had to have dinner somewhere nice that night, and it would be his treat like usual. I'd completely forgotten about my plans to call it off until he said that. His words made me remember that night was the night of the anniversary dinner. I stumbled over my words when I asked if there was any way that we could do it some other time, because I had already made plans, but he told me in this careless manner to cancel them. That he had already made the reservations and that he was going to be busy the entire weekend, so that was our only chance to celebrate. There was this look he gave me when he saw that I was still hesitant, almost like he was disappointed in me not jumping at the chance to have dinner with him. My promotion hadn't been announced, so I knew it wasn't set in stone yet. Disappointing him could mean losing it altogether, and I couldn't risk that, not even for Eddie. So I told him I would be there, and the second I was out of his office, I called Eddie. He worked overtime for that dinner every year, every single year, and here I was about to ruin it. I let him know that he didn't need to pick me up and that I would just meet him at the restaurant a bit late. I lied and said that I just had too much work to get to. He seemed a bit disappointed that he couldn't pick me up, but said it was fine and that he'd send me the address so I'd meet him when I was ready. It was odd that he said he'll send me the address, since I could have probably driven to that restaurant blindfolded, but my mind was too caught up in everything else to notice. Agreeing to both of them was crazy, and I knew that. But still, a small selfish part of me told myself I could make it work. I'd go to dinner with Javier, stay for an hour, and then come up with an excuse, some fake emergency maybe. Then I'd slip out and go meet Eddie like nothing had happened. He'd never have to know. By the time the day wound down, I'd almost convinced myself it would all be fine. I stayed a little late, pretending to review some files while really just trying to calm my nerves. Javier and I drove away from the office and to the restaurant in separate cars, but he held my waist and led me to our table once we got to the restaurant. Even with the way his hand lingered and his eyes roamed over my body, even though I had literally already had sex with him, I still tried to convince myself it was nothing but a work dinner, a celebration of my achievements. I tried my hardest to be ignorant and naive. The restaurant was one of the most expensive ones I'd ever been to, and I knew the second I sat down and glanced around that Eddie would never be able to afford something like that for us. The place practically screamed wealth. I told myself again that it was just dinner, but then Javier handed me a small box across the table. He said it was a gift to congratulate me, Z. I hesitated only a little before opening it, and when I did, my breath caught in my chest. A thin gold bracelet, delicate and simple but clearly expensive, rested inside. I wanted to refuse, I really did, but the words got stuck in my throat. All I could say was, "Thank you," and I tried to swallow all the guilt I felt. Dinner went by too easily. It was easy to get lost in how good the food was and how rich the wine tasted. It also wasn't hard to imagine that I could have the life Javier was offering me, if only I could just keep doing what I was doing. I got caught up in the amazing night and in him. For a while, I forgot entirely that I was supposed to be somewhere else. It wasn't until someone said my name that I remembered. I knew exactly who it was, and my whole body felt hot as I turned around. The sound of his voice cleared the fog Javier had over me instantly. Eddie was standing there, holding a small gift bag in one hand and looking like he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. He looked from me to Javier, then back again. I pushed out of my chair. It was so loud that people turned to look. I told him that I could explain, but he cut me off. "Explain?" His voice came out rough and sharp enough to draw more eyes from nearby tables. "You're out having dinner with your boss, the same one you told me I was insecure about. What could you possibly explain?" "Please," I whispered, and then I glanced around as I noticed that people had abandoned their dinners in favor of watching us. "Not here." I told him, but he didn't listen. He took a step closer. His face was red with anger and humiliation. "You made me feel crazy for thinking something was going on. You said I was paranoid and that I didn't trust you, and look at you now." I tried to beg and tell him that it wasn't like that, but he just shook his head. He said that it was exactly like that because there I was sitting in a fancy restaurant with Javier, letting him buy me gifts and everything. There was nothing I could say. There was no way to get out of it. The evidence was literally sitting on my wrist. All I could do was beg for us to handle it outside, but he didn't even act like I had spoken to him. I begged some more, but he just snapped at me and told me that I didn't get to hide anymore. He said, "You've hidden enough. Now I want everyone to see you. Since you're always so embarrassed of me, let them see who you really are." I wasn't embarrassed of him. I tried to tell him that, but he wasn't listening. And before I could try and explain some more, he pulled out his phone and angled it toward me and then Javier. It was then I noticed that there were other people recording too. "Eddie, please stop." I begged, but he ignored me. His tone dropped, and he finally stopped yelling when he said his next words. "You know what's funny? I worked extra shifts this week. I barely slept because I wanted to surprise you for our anniversary." He glared at me, and it looked like he was almost tearing up. "How do you think I found you there? This place was supposed to be our surprise. I saved up for weeks because I thought you deserved somewhere nicer this year. Guess you wanted to surprise me too." I tried to say something, but my throat was dry, and I kept getting choked up. He stared at me for another moment, and then he tossed the bag in his hand on the floor at my feet. "You've always been ungrateful," he said with his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Always wanting more like nothing's ever enough for you. I hope you enjoy this because you're going to hate what comes next, but you'll deserve it." And then he turned and walked out, leaving me standing there frozen as the entire restaurant watched on. When I finally snapped out of the haze I was in, I ran after him. I didn't even think, but he was already gone. I waited in front of the restaurant and ordered a ride, hoping that he would be home and then we could actually talk, but he wasn't there when I got back. I called him over and over again. I texted repeatedly, but he didn't respond at all. I fell asleep on the couch, waiting for the moment he would walk through the front door, but it never came because he didn't come home that night, or the next, or the night after that. I spent that weekend doing all I could to reach him. I even called his sister and his friends, but they hadn't heard from him either. Or maybe they had, and they didn't want to tell me because Eddie had told them what I'd done. By Sunday night, I was blind with panic and dread. I didn't know what he was planning or if he was safe. I just knew that something was coming, and whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. When Monday came, I forced myself to go to work. But the second I walked into the office, I knew something was wrong. There was a way people looked at me and whispered. I knew something awful had happened before I even got the email from HR calling me in for a meeting. When I got there, Javier was already seated, his expression tight. Across from him were 2 HR managers and one of the senior partners. No one smiled when I walked in. "Please, have a seat," one of them said, and the air instantly felt heavy. The woman from HR spoke first, explaining that they'd received an anonymous report about an inappropriate relationship between me and Javier, along with videos and photos from the restaurant incident circulating online. My stomach dropped as they slid a tablet toward me, and I was able to see grainy footage of me, Javier, and Eddie's outburst frozen on the screen. There were also photos and videos of us that only Eddie could have recorded. They said it would typically be a private matter, but now that it was all online, it had become a company issue and something they needed to get ahead of. Javier tried to intervene, but they cut him off. Seeing him scolded and shot down like that made him lose some of his allure as this all-powerful man. They turned to me afterwards and gave me the news. I was terminated effective immediately, while Javier was just suspended. They said the optics were bad, especially after my husband's post that morning, since he'd tagged me, Javier, and the company, and it was already spreading fast. This, they said, was something that had to be done. I just sat there numb and barely able to breathe because I didn't even know about any post. The meeting ended quickly, and I was encouraged to pack my things after they gave me my severance check. My vision was blurry when I got to my desk, and as I packed my things, and I was sobbing by the time I got to my car. I sat in my car and pulled up Eddie's profile. He never posted much. His account was almost empty except for a few old photos of us. But now there was a new post pinned to the top. A picture of me and Javier at the restaurant with a long caption. He'd written about how he'd worked extra hours to surprise me, and how he'd walked in to find me on a date with my boss instead. He didn't hold back. He laid everything out there, and at the bottom was my name tagged. I scrolled through the comments until I couldn't anymore. People were tearing me apart, some pitying him, but most were mocking me and calling me every name imaginable. That night, I laid in bed and scrolled through the post again and again. Every line felt like a knife being twisted, and what hurt most was that his words weren't lies. I was the one who had ruined it all. I destroyed our marriage. Days passed, then weeks, but there was still no word from him. Calls, texts, and even emails went unanswered. The company sent me a formal termination letter and a statement saying they'd conducted an internal review. Javier was still suspended, and they made it clear we were not to contact each other. Not that he'd tried. I hadn't heard a single word from him either. He was probably doing what he could to protect himself, to save whatever was left of his reputation. Mine was unsalvageable. The story had made the rounds in the PR circle. My name was absolutely ruined. There wasn't a chance I would ever work in PR again. No respectable company would employ me. And what made it all worse was that I kept waiting for Eddie to show up, maybe just to yell at me or insult me, or to finally hand me the papers and end it properly. But he didn't. He still hasn't. I know he isn't done with me, though. He'd taken my job, my reputation, and whatever dignity I had left. but the real blow would be the divorce. I know he'll want to make it official and final. And when that envelope finally comes, marking the end to the years of marriage that I blew up with my own hands, I'm not sure how I'll be able to hold myself together.